As I was thinking about Rally Day today and our kind of back to school theme this week, I thought and recalled the old nursery rhyme, the school song that some of you probably learned over the years. School days, dear old golden rule days. We don't need to go any farther than that. But it made me think about this passage and wonder if this passage, which appears in a lot of church constitutions under the discipline section, is really about rules or relationships. If Jesus is giving us rules to live by, then we have some things to keep in mind. It's a very neat little formula that Jesus gives us here. If it's about rules, then if someone offends you, you confront them. If that doesn't work, then you try an intervention. If that fails, you cut them off and kick them out. It's like baseball. 3 strikes and you're out. If nothing else, it's a pretty straightforward way of approaching this text, which is maybe why a lot of folks like to read it that way. But if this text is about relationships, then we've got a much more challenging interpretation ahead of us. I mean, what if Matthew wasn't simply setting up rules of engagement, but is rather trying to build an authentic Christian community? What if the point is less about having a code of conduct to follow and more about regaining a sister or a brother? And what if Matthew's major concern isn't actually about settling disputes, but creating an environment where Christ's presence and joy continues to bring forgiveness and healing? I say that because in the verses immediately preceding today's gospel, Jesus talks about how joyful God is in gathering back to the fold even one lost sheep that strayed. And in the verses immediately following today's gospel, Peter asks Jesus, how many times should I forgive my brother or sister? Up to 7 times? And Jesus says, not 7 times, but 70 times 7 times. And then he goes on to suggest in a parable that our ability to forgive others may be the key factor upon whether we ourselves are forgiven by God. In other words, Jesus is letting us know that we need each other, not only for practical reasons, but for spiritual ones as well. We need each other like brothers and sisters need each other to remind ourselves that we belong to one family. When families work right, they're God's way of teaching us important things, like how to get along and how to work together and how to take care of one another. Living with other people, we learn that we can't have everything our way all the time. We have to learn to compromise. And while it's never easy, learning this give and take is part of what it means to be fully human. However, and I'm sure this does not surprise any of us here, sometimes our families don't work quite the way that God intends for them. They become not schools in self-control and forgiveness, but reformatories where rules are more important than people. That's the lesson that many families teach, and it's a shame, because in today's gospel, Jesus lets us know that that's not how the Christian family is supposed to work. In God's family, when a brother sins against you, you must go and ask, can we talk? And if that doesn't work, you must keep going back, doing everything in your own power to get your sister or your brother back again. In fact, Jesus seems less interested in who's right and wrong than he is in getting the family back together again. The important thing is that we listen to each other, he says. But if a member of the family refuses to listen over and over again, if the door for communication stays firmly shut, then we shouldn't pretend that nothing's happened. We're to recognize that one of our members has left the family, because the only thing worse than losing a brother or sister is pretending that you haven't. That's hard, but honest advice that Jesus gives. One of those pieces of advice that we know is right and that we know we should take, but one that's still hard to act upon. In his book, The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis paints a picture of hell that applies here, because it bears such a resemblance to the way that so many people live today. He says that hell is like a vast city inhabited only at its edges, with rows and rows of empty houses in the middle. And they're empty because once upon a time, a long time ago, people used to live next to one another as neighbors, and then something happened, and they stopped talking to one another, and so they moved, and then they lost contact with those neighbors and moved again and again and again, so that hell was always expanding, and people were always living at the outskirts of it. That's how hell got so large, Lewis says, because everyone in it chose distance instead of confrontation as the solution to a fight. And when I say confrontation, I mean exactly what the dictionary says by that: to speak to one another face to face, to bring people together face to face, to sort out what's going on in between the two of them. That's what today's gospel is recommending as well. And it's also what most of us would do just about anything in our power to avoid. Excuses rush to our lips if we want them to. Why should I go to her? She's the sinner, let her come to me. Tell him my feelings are hurt? What if he just hurts them again? I wouldn't know what to say. I would feel so foolish. And what's the use anyhow? They're never going to change. Those are all fine excuses. Excuses that many of us may have uttered at some point or another in our lives. Fine excuses if you don't mind living on the outskirts of hell. But for those of us who are called to Christian community, they just won't do. For us, the real problem is not the brother or sister who sinned against us, but our own fierce need to be right, or to protect ourselves, or even our need to punish those who do something wrong. The real problem is the speed to which most of us are ready to forsake our relationships in favor of nursing our hurt feelings or our wounded pride. In other words, the problem is how eager we are to repay someone else's sin with sin of our own. But Jesus says there's another way. We can go to them and tell them what's wrong, or at least what we think is wrong, because the best way to end a fight is to admit that we too might have it wrong. There are certain questions we can ask. Questions like, have I given the other person the benefit of the doubt? And what are my motives in coming to her with my feelings? And do I just want to make him feel bad? Or do I really want peace? And finally, is this relationship worth the risk? That last question is an important one, because the only reason to take Jesus' advice in the first place is to win back a relationship that's in danger of being lost. Once you've decided that that's what you want to do, it helps to remember that you're working for the relationship, not against it. That your goal is reconciliation and not retribution. And that being right is less important to you than being in relationship with the other person. And if you ever wonder who would be so foolish as to do something like that, to live by those unusual priorities, then look no farther than Christ himself, who on the cross showed us that it is God's goal for reconciliation and not retribution, and that sin and even death itself will not become between us and our relationship with God. Indeed, the good news today is that even when we fail to reconcile with our sisters and brothers, God will not stop in trying to restore God's relationship with each of us. In a lot of ways, it can be a real nuisance to be a part of a family. It'd be so much easier if we would just be a bunch of individuals loosely bound by similar beliefs, but whose affairs remain essentially a private matter between ourselves and God. But our life together is an essential way that God has chosen to be among us, and it's of ultimate importance to God. Our life together is the place where we are comforted and confronted. Our life together is the place where we are tested and redeemed by God with the help of each other. As Paul says today, love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. For the church, love is the supreme law of its land. Even when everything in us wants to fight back, still we're called to community with one another, to ask each other, can we talk? To act like the family of God that Christ has made us to be. That's what we're called to do, to confront and make up, to forgive and seek forgiveness, to heal and to be healed, to realize that where two are stuck together in their can't we just get along shirts, that there's still enough room for Jesus to be there too. Because it's through him that our relationships are reconciled in ways that we could otherwise never imagine. Amen.